All right. Magandang umaga sa lahat. Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Migs or Miguel Dorotan. I'm the program consultant for the Institute of Global Affairs and Diplomacy under the Miriam College. Welcome to your diplomatic hour. So for this morning, we will be joined by two distinguished guests. No, but before that, just a little bit about the program and a little bit about the institute behind it. So 2 years ago, Miriam College launched the Institute of Global Affairs and Diplomacy, previously as a School of Diplomacy, which specializes on political economy and humanitarian diplomacy. As part of the efforts to bolster the IGAD's profile and contribute to enhancing policy discourse in the Philippines and in the region, IGAD came up or launched the Diplomatic Hour, an online talk show that focuses on political, economic, and humanitarian crisis here in the Philippines as well as globally. So for today, we are joined, as I said, by two distinguished gentlemen from the Philippines that are now making global influence. Our topic today is connected to the freshly concluded Conference of Parties for the COP on climate change. For the next hour or so, let's discuss the Philippine environmental security, mitigating risks from climate change and rising sea level. Again, good morning, everyone. And so let me introduce to you the two gentlemen who will be joining us today. The first one is Amiel Ian Valdez, a research fellow from the Center of International Law of the National University of Singapore, or NUS. He handles the program called Teaching and Researching International Law in Asia. Amiel is also working on international environmental law projects, including climate change. Prior to joining CIL, he was an attorney at the Department of Environment and Natural Resources of the Philippines. He taught public international law at the De La Salle University in Manila. His research works and publications are focused on transboundary environmental impact assessment, climate change litigation, environmental rights, ancestral seas, among others. He is a member of the Philippine Bar since 2012, and he finished his LLM in environmental law first class honors in 2018 at the University of Melbourne in Australia. Before that, he earned his Juris Doctor degree from the Ateneo de Manila University. His pre-law degree was AB Philosophy, magna cum laude from the University of Santo Tomas, Manila. For our second gentleman joining us, Dr. Ven Paulo B. Valenzuela is also a research fellow at the Asian Urbanism Cluster of the Asian Research Institute of the National University of Singapore. His research explores climate change and disaster risks in coastal and urban Asia-Pacific and employs transdisciplinary methods to holistically understand contemporary global challenges. He was involved in the global policymaking on climate change and disasters, and his works has been cited by key scientific reports such as the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report. His current research interests focuses on the social dimensions of advanced site adaptation to climate change and disasters. So for example, sports, seawalls, land reclamation, and floating settlements. He earned his Bachelor of Arts in Social Sciences degree, major in Social Anthropology from the University of the Philippines in Baguio 2011. He was granted the Japanese government scholarship in 2016, and he earned his Master's in Sustainability Science degree in 2018 and his PhD in Sustainability Science in 2021 from the Graduate Program in Sustainability Science Global Leadership Initiative at the Graduate School of Frontier Sciences at the University of Tokyo. Dr. Valenzuela is a recipient of the Master's Research Award at GPSS-GLI, the 2019 Asian Graduate Student Fellowship during his PhD at the Asian Research Institute, National University of Singapore, as well as Dean's Award for Outstanding Achievement for Doctoral Course at the Graduate School of Frontier Sciences at the University of Tokyo. Magandang umaga, Paulo at Amiel.
Magandang umaga.
All right, sige.
Gandang umaga.
Okay, so we're just checking. I think I just saw a message that okay, that has been fixed. The audio. All right. Let's go straight to topic, shall we? Gentlemen? Right.
Good.
Okay. It's quite fresh at the moment, the COP27, right? Very interesting, and there's been a lot of talk about the global impact of climate change and how it differs from country to country, how inequity is highlighted by climate change. So my first question to you too, no? What do we actually mean when we talk about environmental security, and why is it important to discuss? Let's start there. Who wants to take the first? Yeah, yeah. Amiel, go ahead.
Well, first of all, Mix, I just want to say thank you to the Institute of Global Affairs and Diplomacy of Miriam College through the leadership of Dr. Chad Ravenna, because I think this is a very interesting platform, and it's as you were saying, it's timely to talk about this topic following the conclusion of the climate conference in Egypt just this November. For me personally, I don't think there is a uniform definition of environmental security. And here, I would, in a way, use some of the standard being used by some of the scholars who are saying that environmental security is basically a subset of human security, a much broader concept. And I say that because, although I know there are some scholars who might not agree with this kind of approach, because there's always that debate when you talk about environment, are you going to view it from anthropocentric point of view or an ecocentric point of view? But when we talk about climate change, it's difficult to disassociate human security from environmental security. So environmental security is basically security against so many different risks from environment, including climate change, ecosystem degradation, biodiversity loss, among many others. Yeah. And perhaps Paulo may have something more to say, because I think his expertise is more into social and scientific aspect of climate change.
That's right. You mentioned, Amel, about ecocentric, anthropocentric, etc. Maybe Paulo, could you expound on that, and why are we even talking about it right now?
So basically, climate change is a global systematic problem, right? So you have to tackle it between, like how do we protect societies? That's usually the anthropocentric view. But there's another side. We need to protect the environment and put the environment. That's the usual biocentric view. The middle ground is the ecocentric view that you would have to balance these two. I would say, it depends on your bias. But it's quite critical to have at least overlapping concepts on how these work. But yeah, I really thank the Institute for Global Affairs and Diplomacy, and of course Dr. Jen for inviting me here, because this is actually a very timely topic. So let's talk about environmental security or security against climate change in general. So the recently concluded Conference of Parties agreed to a very landmark deal, which is loss and damage. So what is loss and damage? Basically, these are the damages or losses incurred through by climate change that we could not neither adapt to or mitigate from. So yun yung basically mawawala sa atin because of climate results. And ito ay compounding effect. So if we don't mitigate it now or we don't reduce risks now, what happens is itong costs na to, they will be compounding and it will threaten our development. So I think yun yung security from this concept of security, and it gives us some kind of some kind of cushion in order to at least try to mitigate and adapt now. So yun yung I think answer ko. Although sagot ko na rin yung what's the COP.
So yeah, right. Siguro before we dig deeper to that, and also before we discuss even about mitigation and risk adaptation, etc. How important is it for the Philippines to discuss this, and for the Philippines to be at the forefront for tackling or even discussing environmental security? I remember quite faintly. Not much in detail, but in the past few years, in the previous COPs, the Philippines have been highlighted especially I think in the time of Attorney Oposa, etc. Right. So let's bring it down to the Philippines, no? But also having that global thinking now. It while it is closer to home, why is it closer? How is it? How close is it to home? But also, how does it link globally?
Can I go ahead, Mix?
Yes, go ahead, Amir.
Yes, because this is a very this is the topic that I'm really passionate about. It's very close to us. The issue is very close to us because um, I think there's less debate now. If you look at it from recent years, how Philippines really suffer from the impacts of climate change, and I'm referring in particular to the presence of typhoons and super typhoons, and we are a coastal state. We are located right at the gate of the western side of the Pacific Ocean. So that's the very topic of this discussion, right? We're talking about sea level rise, and it's inevitable for us to see that problem at some point in the future. But I think more importantly is we can feel now in our generation how the increasing number of typhoons, especially yung destructive typhoons, are sort of challenging yung infrastructure natin and overall human development in the Philippines. Yeah, so that's why I think it's a very important issue for Philippines right now.
Right. Thanks, Samuel. But is there any like example? Have you been around the Philippines and exactly seeing it on the ground? Abakasi or Pau. In your previous studies, any things that you have documented about how really it is affecting us?
Yeah.
Great.
Paolo. Go ahead, Paolo.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry, you were saying something.
Yeah. I remember this, but I'm not directly involved in this particular study, but I remember encountering this in one of the reports. I think it was a report published by Rappler. There is this barangay somewhere in La Union, actually, and they were really complaining about they have already moved several times. Yung classrooms nila, for example, they have moved it like 5 times already because they can see how yung sea itself is slowly, gradually eating up yung land area. And based on the response from the Mines and Geosciences Bureau, which is also part of the DNR, the overall framework of DNR, they admitted actually, some of our experts from MGB are saying that this is already a part of the climate change impact, especially if we're talking about sea level rise. And when we talk about typhoons, Mix, I think the sets of data are very much are all available online and readily available to public. I remember back in kailan ba yung super typhoon Yolanda? It was
2018.
2013 ang Yolanda.
13.
Yeah, but we have stronger typhoons as well in recent years. So in Yolanda, I think we're talking about like billions of pesos in terms of damage to property and agriculture. So hindi talaga may kakaila na lahat ng ito are related to the issue of climate change. And I think when we talk about climate change, it's important to have a good grounding of the scientific basis. Pag tinignan mo yung assessment report na nabanggit ni Paolo earlier, I think yung works ni Paolo were cited in the assessment report. There, less debate na rin na yung intensity ng typhoons now are attributed to climate change itself. Yeah.
Thanks, Samuel. Pau?
Yeah, right. So this is right smack into my research. So I have like 3 ways to tackle. Kasi may niraise si Amiel about the area in Aringay, La Union, which I've been to as well. But this is actually a cautionary tale. So I'll put it at the end. Okay. So first, ang Pilipinas, every year we actually eat category 3 to category 5 typhoons regularly, which is not something that's, being experienced by other countries. So for example, Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, they're all along the Pacific Ring of Fire, and at the same time, they're all along the typhoon tracks. But almost all most of these category 3 to category 5 typhoons hit the Philippines. If the Philippines didn't exist, Vietnam and China will actually be experiencing a lot worse. That said, Amiel is right. The thing with tropical cyclones is that the number based on climate change will not increase. So the frequency will not increase. But the number of intense typhoons will increase. So every year we experience 20 to 25 typhoons coming into the country. And currently, or like in the previous studies, we probably of those 20, 25, that's 5 destructive. But we could project in the next, in the climate change scenario, it will be 10 destructive out of 25. That's already quite a lot. Now going back to why climate change is an important topic. It actually affects us all. So, for example, noong 2009, Ondoy, tinamaan tayo ng, malaking baha. And I think this has created like this climate change. That is all well and good. We can actually attribute things with climate change. But the biggest warning that I would actually have to give is that climate change is an exacerbating factor. It's not the reason why we have natural hazards right now. It's why we are experiencing intense disasters is simply because the interaction between development issues that we are not able to address and the exacerbating impacts of climate change. So you cannot address climate change impacts if you do not address development issues. The third point that I wanted to raise is that when we talk about climate change, you need to know the science because it can go wrongly. So let's go back to the Aringay La Union case. So basically, this area, pinuntahan ko siya, nakita ko yung area in itself. And yes, in the perception of the people, the seas are rising. And of course, there is still sea level rise. But most of its sea level rise is because of coastal erosion, which is contributed of different factors, including development aggression. So you cannot remove the concept of development issues within the context of climate change. Climate change is an exacerbating factor. Kaya medyo problematic yun is that sometimes we say, oh, climate change na yan. Pero hindi yan climate change totally. You have to bring it into a discussion of development. Otherwise, what's going to happen is that you would have leaders, or you're putting all of the responsibility to a climate change issue when in fact it can be dealt locally. So yun yung isang critical point on climate change.
Thank you, Pao. I'd like to what they call this highlight why you're quite conscious when you said disaster hazard rather than calling it a disaster or natural. Sorry, you said natural hazard rather than a natural disasters. That's quite very important, I think, at this point to highlight, no? And with all this talk about anthropogenic development work, etc., could you expound more on why the impacts of climate change does not necessarily have to lead to natural disaster? Because if we're gonna follow the global trend now, the saying is that there's no such thing as natural disasters, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Right. So basically, if we look at the concept, the term natural disaster, this has been used in the 70s and the 80s. So this is a problematic term because we are dealing with events and we're terming it as natural when in fact it's not natural at all. Disasters are a result of either human action or inaction, and you cannot replace the human aspect of it. In a sense, like for example, tinamaan ng bagyo ang isang bundok na walang tao. Matatawag mo bang disaster yun? Pero kung may namatay doon, pwede mo na tawagin disaster. Ganun siya. It is this concept. On the other hand, that's why it's also like, it also deals with the biocentric perspective. For example, nasira yung environment mo because of an exacerbating natural hazard. And tinamaan din yung fisheries and etc. aquatic resources mo. Hindi na makakope yung system. Even you as a human being, as part of the system could not, then that becomes a disaster in itself. So that's why like we're very cautious on using the term. So when we talk about typhoons, storm surges, we term it as hazards. when we talk about, let's say, for example, kahirapan, we term it as vulnerabilities, because we need to be very cautious with these terms. Otherwise, what happens is that we go back to this cycle of we blame the natural events for things that we could have done, controlled or protected. So, yeah. Yun lang naman. It's an evolving term actually. So, but right now we don't want to use the term,
natural disasters. Okay.
Let's
Amel, Amel, do you want to weigh on that? How do you link that with human security?
Ang initial thought ko lang is I agree with Paolo na there's still a lot of debate when it comes to which one is the correct terminology to use. And this is not something uncommon, yung last climate conference in Egypt, there were several discussions. What do you mean really by phasing out, for example, fossil fuel? What do you mean by fossil fuel? Does it include coal lang, or are we talking about even natural gas? So may mga ganong debate. The point that I'm trying to raise here is even sa paggamit ng terminology in climate change framework, merong disagreement in terms of usage and interpretation. So when it comes to human security, you were asking, Mix. I think, again, this is related to, for example, how does typhoon, for example, or how do super typhoons on basically large-scale weather event affect, for example, yung livelihood and property of the people living in coastal areas. So just to give you a bit of a visual context, we know na archipelagic state yung Philippines. We have so many islands. We have 7,000 plus islands. And based on, I think, a 2012 study, if I remember correctly, a 2012 study of World Bank, medyo matagal na, but I think it's still relevant. Most of our islands, most of our provinces in the Philippines are actually coastal. Most of our municipalities are coastal, and we have like 60% of our population living in coastal areas. So inevitable talaga to talk about human security. How do these large-scale weather systems, whether or not you agree that they are brought by climate change, affect yung situation natin as Filipinos, especially those who are living in coastal areas. So that's why I think meron talagang inextricable link between environment and human security. Even though you can always argue na, when you talk about environmental security, you can talk about it independently from human security.
Yeah. Thanks, Samuel. Actually, the discussion on human security, environmental, etc., reminds me of the recent pandemic, and where it highlighted. I don't know if you've heard of the One Health framework, right? So when you talk about any diseases, you have to talk about the humans, your environment, and then the pathogen, right? Or animals, rather. So you cannot be talking about pandemics or diseases without talking and tackling the whole thing. So I think it looks like it's similar, what we're doing, discussing now. All right. Coastal areas still on the impacts. Is just trying to picture, an imagery of how large scale the problem or the concern on climate change and rising sea levels, right? Amiel and Paolo, you both are based in the NUS. Singapore is a coastal area. Right? What does that mean in the having just and then you have also the Pacific Islands of Tuvalu that are shrinking. What does that mean? I mean, what kind of impact will it lead to if you know that already is rising sea levels? Maybe segueing to the mitigation and adaptive practices that we need to start thinking about or should have done 10 years ago. Yeah.
Well, very good question, Mix. Interestingly, so this highlights, if we compare Singapore and Philippines, for example, this just highlights na yung issue on adaptation is really local. Because here we don't have typhoons here. I don't even remember having typhoon here in Singapore. Although minsan yung weather can be chaotic.
Storm.
Yeah.
Thunderstorms.
But we don't have something as destructive as the ones that we have in the Philippines. No, yung talagang nasisira talaga yung bahay, lahat ng pananim and agriculture. We don't have something. So in a way, Singapore is lucky to be located in this part of the globe. Unlike Philippines, na talagang nasa gate tayo ng Pacific Ocean. But for Vietnam, for example, after minsan dumaan yung bagyo sa Philippines, pupunta yan ng Vietnam. And so sometimes the situation in Vietnam is almost the same as in the Philippines. The ones in the Pacific are really the ones who are experiencing this so-called existential aspect of climate change. Because most of the countries in the Pacific are low-lying islands. So I have never been there. I've been to Fiji, and malaking issue talaga yung sa kanila, no, na at some point, yung Fiji nga medyo elevated pa yan eh. But if you look at Kiribati and Vanuatu, that's really a problem because there will be an issue of displacement mix. Where will they go? That's the question. Unlike in Philippines, we have so many islands. We can migrate from one island to another where we feel it might be safer. But that doesn't mean there's no problem. So we still have to address that problem of sea level rise, yeah, and compounded by yung effect ng typhoon, yung storm surges, for example. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, Paulo?
Yeah, so when it comes to sea level rise, yes, there's this issue of retreat. That's what Amiel was talking about. Because of sea level rise, people in low-lying islands will have to move further inland or move away. Ironically, this is where the science debate is. There are two sides of it. And I'm in the optimistic side of things, ironically, because we need to be optimistic, even though we're facing this harsh reality. When we talk about climate change, it's the scenario that we always talk about is 2100. Mm-hmm. That's what 80 years from now, right? We cannot think about. We tend to think about 2100 scenarios, but we cannot think about 2030 scenarios, 2040 scenarios, 2050 scenarios. It's still like some steps away. And this is like the important point of like all of these negotiations is that we need to act now in order for the 2100 scenario not to happen. So why am I bringing this up? One, climate change is a representation of global inequalities. We talk about Singapore, Philippines, the Pacific Islands. I'm in Tokyo right now. And you would go around the coastal zones and you would see a lot of defenses. Singapore, for instance, has reclaimed 24% of its land. And it is designed, I think the current situation, it was designed for about 2 meters sea level rise. And now further reclamation is 4 meters above sea level to combat sea level rise. So that's the Singapore scenario. And they also put in a lot of defenses, the Marina Barrage over there. And then you go there, actually malalaman nyo yung what they call this, how climate change is incorporated to Singapore's development. In Tokyo, mas baliw sila, they would build a 20 meters wall or like some stuff like this. But if you realize that is that the wealthy nations are the ones who are able to actually defend. Whereas the middle income countries and the poorer, least developed countries, developing countries are the ones who are suffering both the brunt and at the same time, what they call this, like, having the inability to actually mitigate the risks. So when it comes to the Philippines, because like we need to bring it back home, nakikita natin is that when we talk about, are we doing enough? We are mama in a sense, because innately, and this is something that I hate whenever typhoon comes in, like, okay, magagalit yung mga tao, resilience na naman. Ironically, resilience natin yung pinaka-core strength natin. But the thing is, it's just only within the communities. Nasaan yung ating accountability with our... Go ask people whether if we have a system to manage floods. And they will point to you to a dike. Na pagdating sa next na taon, wala na silang dike. But floods don't care about political boundaries at all. Floods will flow from the mountain towards the sea. They don't care whether kung bayan to ng bayan A, bayan B, bayan C to. So ganun ang nangyayari sa we tend to think about it politically when it needs to be a systematic approach to things. So what are we doing not, yun yung isang issue ko. But more important, than that is basically we should not remove the people's ability or to adapt. So I've been to a lot of places in the Philippines when I saw local adaptation to occur. In one of the areas in Bohol, right in between the islands of Cebu and Bohol, noong 2013 nagkaroon ng earthquake and lumubog yung island nila by 1 meter. And then so eventually they suddenly experienced sea level rise of 2100 now. And they did adapt. Were able to live with the floods. In Bulacan, right now, especially during king tides or the highest tides of the year, you would go yung mga binabahang area. Kung hindi ka tiga this area, parang sabi mo, binabaha na sila, sea level rise, and then all of this threatening. But tignan mo yung local transportation nila. Actually, inangat na nila minsan yung kanilang mga makina, ganyan. So you should not discredit the ability of local people to adapt to climate change because ito yung tutuntungan mo eh. Ito yung critical na aspect doon sa loss and damage fund ng COP27. So, ganun siya na parang that's why this concept of retreat, and let's go back to this concept of retreat. Yes, if we do not do now, people will have to move further. But there's also a bad side to thinking of relocation as a solution because a lot of our poor people are living in at-risk zones right now. And relocation, and then this concept of risk, yung ganyan, nasa delikado kang lugar, ginagamit ito as justification para paalisin itong mga tao. We cannot talk about environmental security without talking justice. And this is one critical aspect na hindi mo dapat tanggalin sa isa't isa. Otherwise we're just repeating the cycle. Those who can adapt are those who have the money. But that's not how it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be just adaptation.
So, thank you so much. Mukhang si Amel kanina pa tumatango eh.
Yeah.
May gusto ko sabihin before I go to...
Very interesting points na ni-raise ni Paolo. No? Pero balikan ko lang yung sa Singapore no? And how they are preparing in terms of sea level rise. So here, if I recall correctly, yung Prime Minister ng Singapore announced 2 years ago, sometime 2019 I think, na they're allotting around $100 billion para lang to address specifically yung issue ng sea level rise. And they're doing something about that already. And so yung sea level rise, nangyayari na talaga yan. But we are not just seeing it. Yung effect niya talaga, generally speaking, is because kasi slow onset event nga siya. And as Paolo was saying, maybe siguro sa 2100 or beyond that, there you will see yung difference na kung gaano kataas yung sea noon at saka ngayon or many years before our generation. So that differentiates Singapore from countries like Philippines. No, here they have a very good set of data, and that's why they can plan well. If you don't have good set of scientific data, then you won't have a very good policy and law that you can put in place to address yung impact ng climate change. And that is related to what Paolo is saying about having a systematic approach. No, especially important, for example, for places like Metro Manila, we're talking about different local government units within a particular region, and iba-iba yung policy nila, di ba? So it's the same for other parts of the Philippines. But I agree na may ginagawa naman yung Philippines, I think. For example, in the recently concluded COP, actually Philippines, I think, sort of was quite proactive in terms of pushing for the loss and damage, which is one of the gains of that COP. No, and I think hindi lang naman to yung first time na ginawa ng Philippines yan. But I just feel that we should be doing something more. And like I said, this goes back to the issue on having credible, accurate, and current data before we can move forward and address yung talagang impact ng climate change.
Thank you so much, Amel. It just reminded me when you talked about data and actually information right now, how scarce it is, especially for developing countries and poor countries. I remember in 2017, we did a scoping review ng team namin on climate change and health. So we looked at 1980s all the way to 2016 publications and grey literature related to climate change and health. You lean towards naman related to it about the Philippines. And guess how many documents you were able to uh, to see or review. 30 years. Sige. Amiel, Pao.
I'm not really sure, but I'm guessing malamang konti lang.
Konti lang nga. It was a mere. So at the time we did that scoping review, we found around a mere 30 literatures related to climate change and health in the Philippines. And ilan ang Pinoy dun sa mga nag-publish?
Right on.
That's a good point, actually.
That hits home.
Paolo, you're in University of Tokyo right now. No?
Yeah.
Right. One of my principals, one of our friends who worked on this is actually based now in University of Tokyo. But that also one person, na Filipino, is not even in the Philippines. I don't know if you've heard of him or met him, Xerxes Siposo.
Familiar.
Yes, so it's also in Japan. So
I mean, like, dugtungan ko lang to kasi frustration ko talaga to eh. Like, whenever I talk to students as well, lalo na, like, kung may PhD students dito, nako, yari kayo. Kasi,
meron, alam ko may dalawa dapat dito. So
there is a dearth of information sa sa literature. Like, tinype ko, disaster risk reduction, Southeast Asia, coastal hazards. You would think marami, di ba? Tapos bakit ako, I'm just a young early career researcher. Bakit ako sa top 10 authors? Ganyan, parang dapat meron pang iba. So, parang hindi ko siya maintindihan na parang bakit ganun. And then we do talk about this a lot. So this is a huge challenge. Like, if you do your master's research, if you do your PhD, it is your due diligence to actually publish it. Kasi the IPCC doesn't care about these, like, development reports, yung mga ginagawa ng mga like civil society and NGOs. It's a different frustration of mine. Kausap ko rin sila.
Right.
But we can only cite scientific articles, peer-reviewed scientific articles, and then we don't have this, like, this culture of, like, I had to go to the Philippines literally and susuugin ko yung mga library para lang makabasa. And the researchers that we do, yung mga thesis, they're actually quite good. Nakakatakot ka pag binabasa. Sabi ko parang, nakakatakot itong work nila. Gaganda nito. Tapos hindi nila pinapublish. Parang samantalang ako, yung mga pinapublish ko, parang alam mo yung may ganun. Sayang talaga. Pero it's something that we really need to push. Kasi black hole.
Yeah.
Yun yung, we did the IPCC thing and then I was talking with the authors. Black hole ang Southeast Asia.
Right. But mukhang kailangan natin another session to tackle that inequalities on research and even publication. Even, I mean, Pao, positions na namin yan. Even when tapping on the funds, I mean, who could do publish online and then on a free, right? So, may kaakibat rin na. Anyway, sorry. Balik lang ako. So, you've been talking about COP. I've been mentioning it for quite a while now. Can you try to break it down on more of a layman's term so that everybody would be able to understand whether you're just starting off to understand climate change or so, and how important the COP is? You've mentioned several. I'm just gonna run through several terminologies here. Loss and damage. You mentioned that diplomacy, negotiations, important global inequalities. So. Can we talk about this in the same time, defining and explaining what the COP is really about and why is it important? But before you answer that, I'd like to address the audience right now. If you have any questions, feel free to type them out already in the chat box. Kung nahihiya kayo, you can private message it to me, or later on, kung meron naman kayong you want to expound more on your ideas or question, then please raise your hand so we will acknowledge you and will let you ask your question directly to our speakers or even contribute to the discussion. Okay? Sige. On that note, COP 20 or not even COP, and then you go to the COP 27. Paolo, wants to start.
Yeah. So maybe I'll just say something very quickly. Then I'll pass the virtual mic to to Paolo. Siguro ano lang, 101, Climate Change Law 101. We say COP. COP stands for the Conference of Parties. And it's 27 kasi it's already the 27th time that the parties to the UNFCCC or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So, kaya UNFCCC. 27 times na silang nag-meet, and that's why you call it COP27. And if you read the materials about COP, there's also what you call CMA or CMP. Yung CMA is the Conference of Parties serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, something like that. Medyo mahaba siya, but it's shortened as CMA. So in other words, when global leaders, experts, negotiators meet in a certain place, in this case, for this year, sa Egypt nangyari, they meet not only as parties to the UN Convention on Climate Change, but also sa Paris Agreement. Kasi from legal, and also Kyoto Protocols. Kasi from legal standpoint, there are three main international law instruments pertaining to climate change. The mother one is the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And then after that, yung parties sa Climate Change Convention, they agreed na at that point, back in 1992, that at some point, they will have this kind of protocol, basically to talk about the commitments of developed countries at that time. Yun kasi yung pressing issue nung time na yon, mga late 90s. Ano yung accountability, basically, in developed countries, because we're talking about the historical emissions of rich countries. And then after that, I mean, there are so many debates whether or not Kyoto Protocol failed. And that's why nagkaroon ng Paris Agreement back in 2015. So all of this, from legal standpoint, are binding. In other words, if a country like Philippines is a party to any of this, we are expected to follow whatever yung provision ng treaties na to. All of these are treaties in terms of legal terminology. Yeah, so yun, climate change 101.
Very good. Thanks, Amir. Paolo?
Right. Actually, yun na yung background niyan. It was formed in 1992, and it was like the Framework Convention. But if in the most layman terms, like, especially like all of these terms, just think of it is basically they meet every year. It's like Congress. It's a place for handling all of the things like you would want to push because the outcome is a legally binding agreement. It's supposed to be a legally binding agreement amongst the parties. So why it's quite critical? Because may mga, like for example, let's go back to, I think the most landmark event is, which is COP 15, basta yung sa Paris Agreement. And let's give credit where credit is due when it comes to one of the biggest changes in the Paris Agreement was the 1.5 degree limit. Okay. So right now we accept, yes, we need to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees as the aspirational target. One of the stories was actually malaki ang role ng Philippines sa paglobby niyan. It's very critical. Like Philippines had played a critical role, if not the leading role, to put that into the agreement. And how did that work? Basically, they had to gamble. In 2015, we didn't have the science yet to back the 1.5 degree claim. But this is what climate change is all about. We need to forecast, understand uncertainty, and make actions now. So that's why it was critical that then to put the 1.5 degree into the text. Kasi ang nag-agree sila doon 2. And we know at that time na parang, 2, medyo delikado yan. Tapos 1.5 dapat. Parang ganun yung usapan. Pero we don't have the science that 2-3 years after, the IPCC comes up with a special report saying, delikado nga pa, yung 1.5 na, yung 2 degrees delikado, yung 1.5 medyo delikado. So sometimes yung legal instrument needs to take into account. We cannot put into account yung what we see right now. We need to be, we need to take into account the precautionary principle in creating this. And that's why it's very critical for all of us to engage the conference of parties every year, especially itong recent, it's loss and damage. So just to answer what loss and damage is, basically it's yung what you will lose or what you can get damaged because of climate change impacts. These are losses and damages that can either be mitigated or adapted to. So, yun yung parang, kumbaga, kahit anong klaseng adaptation pa gawin mo, kahit anong klaseng mitigation pa rin, ito yung cost mo. And sinong tinatamaan yan? Tayo. Yung middle income to developing countries na talagang at like most vulnerable. And that's quite critical kasi what they have agreed is actually to fund loss and damage. So, yun yung napag-agreehan itong.
Paano, Paolo? Paano ang funding?
So yan ang magandang tanong actually. So may mga different facilities yan, yung global climate something facility. May mga different types of facilities yan. Of course, these are something to be discussed pa in the next few months and how it will be rolled out. So that is what is very critical for us as a nation to actually figure out how do we tap into these resources. And this is a huge but at the same time, we have to take into account that we do not solely rely on these resources to adapt and mitigate to climate change.
Okay. I mean, sige. Amel, you have I have some questions coming in. So, sige, go ahead, Amel, before I ask the question.
Yeah, building on what Paulo said, no, yung sa loss and damage. So again, it's a win, considered to be a win by many developing countries. Kasi sa climate change in general, no, cross-cutting kasi yung issue ng climate change and masyadong malawak. But yung issue ng loss and damage has always been the point where developed and developing countries differentiate, basically. And going back dun sa goal ng Paris Agreement, yan yung sinasabi ni Paulo earlier na initially when that agreement was being negotiated, most of the developed countries were really saying, okay, 2 degrees Celsius yung goal natin. And yung developing countries, most of them are the ones who are lobbying for the 1.5. And that's why when you look at Article 2, I think, of the Paris Agreement, makikita mo both kasi yun yung product, yun yung compromise between the two sides of it. But nowadays, especially if you look at the recent negotiations, recent conferences, most of the countries, including developed countries, are now looking at 1.5 degrees Celsius as the target. Kasi nga, as Paulo was saying earlier, if we just stick to the 2 degrees Celsius, ganun pa rin yung impact ng climate change will be there na talaga. So we have to be more ambitious when it comes to limiting yung greenhouse emissions natin. And that's why yung goal now is to keep yung 1.5 degrees Celsius alive. Yun yung terminology na laging ginagamit in every negotiation. But it's always a problem, Migs, because again, dun sa Egypt conference, wala ngang decision kung i-phase out talaga yung yung fossil fuel use. And interestingly, the next host of climate conference next year will be UAE, United Arab Emirates, which is a major producer ng oil, diba? So there are all these debates, and I'm not even sure, I don't have the statistics, but in the Philippines, I'm not sure if we are still using coal powered plants for our electricity, but that would be an issue as well for Philippines and other developing countries like Indonesia, for example. Yung funding, one last point, Migs and Paulo, gusto ko lang din dagdagan yung sinabi ni Paulo. Very important yung sa atin kasi related talaga sa loss and damage yung funding. And yung question mo about how is it going to be rolled out? Yes, wala pa talagang decision. And I think we should manage our expectations on that. It will be discussed for so many years. And yan din yung problema talaga pagdating sa financial institutions. May mga issues na nire-raise yung developing countries like the Philippines na ang hirap i-access yung funds, for example, from the Green Climate Fund and GAF, which are all financial mechanisms of climate change prevention. Yeah, that's it.
But I think we 2 years ago we did tap 500 million from the Green Climate Fund. I remember pumasok sa land bank. Anyways, all right. Let me go to the questions. And also my last point that I want you to tackle. And then siguro si Amel muna tatanungin ko. Wearing your professor hat as an international public law teacher. The question on negotiations, diplomacy, and lobbying, and what's its role really when it comes to COP27 or even COP or even in tackling climate change. And siguro to help you answer that question, I'm reading one question coming from MEP Astilia. No, how does climate change, climate diplomacy play a role in this environmental security, and partly how does it the climate diplomacy and climate science diplomacy interplay in the current climate change negotiation? So sort of napag-usapan yun kanina, no? But if you could expound more on that. And would the ASEAN benefit in having something the same as the EU's Green Deal? But before you answer that question, may naalala lang ako, Amir, na binanggit ng and for the students here or third year, I think sabi sa kanila, isang unang tanong sa kanila ng professor nila ang PIL was that is there even such a thing as international law? Kasi, so, yeah, I don't know how you want to answer those questions, but please go ahead.
Need more than, hindi lang nga isang semester, maybe one entire course to discuss, to answer specifically that question, whether international law is a law or whether international law is international. So these are two different questions, although very related. Gusto ko lang i-answer directly, Mix, yung question mo about what does it mean for diplomacy negotiation. I'll go back to what I said earlier na although adaptation and addressing impacts of the impacts of climate change in terms of adaptation can be very local in that sense. Like kung anong na-experience ng Philippines is very much different from here in Singapore, for example. Or kung anong na-experience ng Philippines, it's difficult to compare that sa Pacific Island state. But if you talk about how to address yung impact na yun, the action should be global. And that's where diplomacy comes in. And I think we should align ourselves with nations who are in a way similarly situated to us, including our neighbors. Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia also is an archipelagic state, no? And I suppose they have the same coastal adaptation problem that we're having. Vietnam, like I said earlier, kadalasan yung typhoon na dumadaan sa Philippines, they go through Vietnam then. Thailand has a problem when it comes to flooding, which is not also something uncommon to Philippines. Now, all of this, kapag nandyan na tayo sa, pag umattend ka ng kasi I had the privilege then to attend one of the climate negotiations back in 2019, no? Before the pandemic. Yan yung dala-dala mo as negotiator of your country. And you will be lobbying for that, no? Now, you will have to join, para siyang power play. You will have to join with other nations who are similarly situated to you. Kasi kung Philippines lang, we are a small voice compared to other much bigger powers out there, especially in developed countries. That's why we need to align ourselves with other countries who have the same issues like us.
Right. Thanks. Before I ask Paulo, you said aligning with or partnering with other countries. As yung last question na related to ASEAN, any bargaining power with the Philippines being part of ASEAN, and what's the voice of ASEAN in COP?
Yeah, so we have to differentiate yung ASEAN from EU, no? The way EU does its work is so different from ASEAN. Although both of them are regional blocks, but I mean, in simple words, I think EU has that personality, has that legal personality to represent yung members niya in negotiation table. ASEAN doesn't have that. So that's why hindi mo pwedeng i-compare. When ASEAN member states go to negotiations, be that climate change, biodiversity conference, or whatever kind of negotiation, usually ASEAN cannot vote on behalf of the 10 member states. Or now, if kasama na yung Timor-Leste, then hindi rin pwedeng mag-vote yung ASEAN in favor of those things. But we can always, ASEAN as a regional bloc, as a regional institution, can always voice yung common interest, common concern ng organization, ng region in itself. And there are many venues to do that. There are many platforms to do that. Mahirap sagutin yung question about yung sa trade, yung EU deal. Kasi maraming aspeto yun na I'm not really sure if we can cover that here. But I think we just have to bear that in mind, that it's different from ASEAN, although they are, in a way, parehong regional bloc. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Amel. Paulo.
Right. Thank you, Amel, sa pag-share din nun. I think like try para malink yung discussion, of course, with diplomacy, the role of diplomacy. Remember, the Conference of Parties or the UNFCCC or the climate change negotiations, isang pinaka-importanting block niyan ay yung concept ng common but differentiated responsibilities. So it's very critical that we play with that. We need to, parang hagulgulin natin yung mga mayamang bansa na they use their own carbon, credits ba tawag, kalimutan yung terming, to fund their development, tapos nawawalan ng development prowess yung mga, middle income to developing countries, right? So Philippines has been a very critical role. So for us, we tend to always tag the Philippines as a developing country, or part of this block, which is okay. Yeah, I get it. We're still in the stage of development, but when we look at documents, we're in a middle income state already, which is also that. What I'm trying to say here is that even though we are richer than the typical developing countries that we have, we are also one of the most hit by climate change impacts. And when you go to these negotiations, nakikita mo na yung central role ng Philippines kasi kaya niyang maghagulgul, mag-push ng mayayamang bansa at nagrarally behind yung mga developing countries on us. And naging leader tayo usually ng Climate Vulnerable Forum, may mga terms sila within the UNFCCC negotiations. Nagiging critical yung role ng Philippines. Kaya medyo problematic kapag naririnig mo sa balita na ang tahimik ng Pilipinas ngayon kasi big sabihin it doesn't play its leadership role within the Vulnerable Forum. I've been lucky as well to be part of the Philippine delegation to Sendai, which is the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And I've seen the critical role of how do you how do you actually use language? How do you use law and diplomatic terms in order to put what you want and what you need, especially forecasting the future. Go to the Paris Agreement in itself. Ang nakalagay doon is the parties agree to limit climate change to 2 degrees with an aspirational target of 1.5 degrees. We wanted to put that 1.5 degrees because that will be our battleground in the future. And that is the critical role of what we can do as even though we're in this middle income being hit by the most intense hazards there is because of climate change. So, ayun yung I think I should share when it comes to the critical role of diplomacy, especially when it comes to this. But it's also quite important that, it's science and policy and stakeholders coming together in order to come up with a just position that would actually enable just adaptation and mitigation.
Thank you so much. Go ahead. Yes, Amel.
Very quickly lang, naalala ko lang kasi, and I think this is a very important point to raise when it comes to diplomacy, Other than yung issue ng loss and damage, marami kasing new initiatives ngayon. Like for example, yung Glasgow conference, before yung sa Egypt, that was the culmination ng Paris Rulebook. Isa sa last issues dyan yung carbon market provision ng Paris Agreement. Now, when you talk about trade, when you talk about carbon market, yung neighboring countries ng Philippines, Singapore for example, meron ng carbon tax dito So carbon tax is part of the carbon pricing system. So if we align ourselves with our neighbors who are leading dun sa mga ganong areas, we can learn so much from them. So I think that's very much related to diplomacy in that sense. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Amel. All right. Now it's already 11:01. Maybe we'll just extend for around 10 minutes if that's okay with everyone. Yeah. Okay. Sige. Magla-lunch time na kay Paolo pero kaya pa naman. Alauna naman ng last time yata dyan sa Japan. Sige. Alright, related to that question, Amel, there are on carbon. There was a question coming from Antonio Morali. Is the 1.5 degrees target a realistic target? Other groups are pushing for the carbon CO2 concentration level targets of for example, 350 ppm. Any thoughts on that?
Okay, magandang tanong yan. Ako na siguro magsagot muna. Because I'll try to deal with it within the scientific perspective. The problem is we don't want to compartmentalize climate change into 1.5 degrees carbon per particles per million, blah blah blah, because all of these are part of a systemic whole. it needs to be like in a systemic perspective. The easiest way to target it was just because 1.5 like the degrees is the easily understood and felt by people. That's why ito yung kita mo, usual na nakikita mo na limit. Pero ang marami pa yan yung particles per million, blah blah blah, and other stuff that we have to look into. But when we talk about climate science and climate awareness, ano yung pinakamadaling ipaintindi sa tao? Umiinit ang temperatura, anong epekto nito? So because this is like where your climate science and science communication comes in. So that said, realistic ba? Did you know that we're already at 1 degree above pre-industrial era? And then we're going, if business as usual, we're going to hit 1.5 degrees in the next decade. So is it realistic? That's why a lot of the pundits are saying we are on the alarm bells now. We're now ringing the alarm bells. Yun lang masasabi ko. I mean, even like I don't want to delve into the uncertainty because like I always like talk about, you know, with the scientists about this. But yeah, ironically, and I think there's like just to bring in the uncertainty concept is that it is in the decade of 2030 to 2040 that all of these scenarios are aligned. So yung business as usual mo, yung best case scenario mo, yung what they call this, like yung limited cuts mo, yung mga different scenarios ng climate change, nandun sila aligned. It depends on your actions whether pupunta ka ba sa worst or pupunta ka sa dun sa ideal scenario. So investments now will have like an extremely like important effect, not the next decade. It's actually 2050. It's for the generations to come. And ayun, bahala kayo kung gusto nyong pasasalaki, give it to the next generation, but we don't want that. We want to stop the problem now. We want to actually like invest now in order for our future generations to experience the life that we are experiencing. So,
right. Thanks, Paolo. Babalik ko kay Amiela, one question, and then before I recognize the gentleman who raised his hand. Amiel, dito, kasi sinabi ni Pao, mukhang we're already above, right? But you said that these agreements are supposedly legally binding.
supposedly.
But supposedly, right? But so what? And then you talked about. You said something about earlier about COP being established in terms of as an accountability, global accountability of different countries. But do we even have instruments in terms of how do we? I don't know. I mean, how do you impose? Is there sanctions or whatever if you don't meet or if countries does not adhere to the agreements?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Mix. Kasi siguro before I answer that, gusto ko lang dagdagan yung sinabi ni Paolo about the 1.5 target. No, whether or not it's realistic, it's again another debatable issue. I'm not so familiar with the scientific benchmark now in terms of ppm. Pero I remember reading yesterday, I think, a report from IISD, International Institute for Sustainable Development, saying na at this point in time, actually, most of the climate scientists are saying na we are already hitting 1.1 degrees yung average na. So ang talagang ideal scenario is for us to keep yung 1.5 by 2030 maybe, or much earlier than that. But like I said earlier, we have to manage our expectations kasi maraming issues in the international negotiation table na hindi kayang sagutin directly because there are so many players. Like I said, yung next host ng climate conference will be a Middle Eastern country, and ang major source ng income nila is and something that made them a lot richer compared to other countries, is yung oil production, di ba? So yeah, in going back to your question on enforceability and implementation of an international law instrument like the Climate Change Convention and Paris Agreement, the main difference really between international law and domestic law is there's no police power in international law framework. Yung accountability goes more on the domestic level. And that's why meron ding area which is called climate litigation. Basically, dito magaling ang Pilipinas yan, mga Pinoy. We're leading on this. Basically, these are some of the examples are like civil society groups filing cases against governments to make the government more accountable. So that's part of the climate litigation. And that's one way, one remedy where you can actually enforce something international in a domestic context. Meron ding development na nangyayari ngayon in international law area, yung Vanuatu. This is going to be a subject of probably the next General Assembly ng UN. It's aiming to gather yung other states, no, to ask the International Court of Justice to give an opinion regarding the accountability or liability of states on climate change. So in international law area, yun lang yung mga pwede mong gawin. But we don't have something like police that will tell you, hey, you violated one of the laws and therefore kukulong ka namin. Walang ganong klase ng konsepto in international arena. Whereas in domestic, di ba, halimbawa criminal law case, if you violate something, you committed a crime, pwede kang makulong. Walang ganong konsepto. So you have to differentiate that when you study international climate change law and policy.
Alright. Sige, wag na natin, may itatanong sana, kaya labas lalong sasakit ang ulo ng mga tao. I'll pause here. PNP Rogelio, sir, please go ahead.
Yes, sir. Good morning po sa inyong lahat. I've been listening with your sharings a while ago, and all of those things are materials. Presently, I am in the local government units and an ENP, environmental planner. And at the same time, I'm also a member of Philippine Council of Foreign Relations. A week ago, I attended the Blue Economy in the concept of regional comprehensive economic partnership with China and ASEAN. And many countries have been sharing their researches about sustainability, which is the center of the topic. And sustainability as a center, they are looking into the what we call the comprehensive and integrated land use planning, which is to include the seabed, because everything we found in the land that we saw can also be found in the seabed that we have. So a blue economy was actually a concept now internationally in order to at least manage the ocean that we have. So we do not have any choice, but we have the different countries are now utilizing and exploiting the resources of the seas and the oceans that we have in the different kind of industries. So there is a need to come up with spatial ocean planning. Spatial ocean planning is one way of dealing with, in order to at least manage yung sea level rise that we have as an effect of climate change that we have. Because if we have carbon sequestration in the land, we have also carbon sequestration in the ocean, which is what we call the blue carbon areas we have. Maintenance of seagrass, maintenance of whatsoever that at least reduce the carbon from the sea. So meron na po tayong actually mga konsepto from Asian and other partner countries regarding this matter. So napakaganda po, because I attended the 5 days 5 days capacity building on blue economy in the concept of RCEP. Now, I would like also to share itong nangyayari sa local government units. You made mention while ago, we do more. We should do more. Because we have DRR, Law and Climate Change Act, already in the country. Now, it's up for the local government units and the national government units how much resources they will put into it in order to address the impact of climate change, and to address the risk of the impact of the disasters that we have. So in my study, my doctorate degree, pinagsama-sama ko yung SDG, no? Mainstreaming of Sustainable Development Goals, CCA, and DRR sa isang platform. And then I evaluated and assessed the local government units. How do they go about it? Do they have a platform on how to do these things? Para at least we can address the negative effect of the climate change. Kasi narinig ko po kanina sa inyo, no? Yung adaptation, yung bounce back, usually every time and then na may mga disasters tayo, ang mabilis na makapag-bounce back ay yung may mga pera. Tama po ba? Nakakabalik sila kaagad, nakaka-recover sila kaagad because they have the means to establish, they have the means to improve their health, to construct their own destroyed properties and so on. No? Pero sa mahihirap, wala. Sabi nga ninyo, doon papasok ngayon yung gobyerno. How should the government of the Republic of the Philippines will have to mitigate the impact of this climate change and the risk of the impact of the climate change. So magkaiba kasi yung konsepto ng risk at saka ng yung impact ng climate change. So yun lang siguro at siguro more time siguro na makakapag-join na kasi inyo, no? At makakapag-discuss tayo regarding climate change and as a professional environmental planner. Maraming salamat po sa inyo lahat.
Thank you so much, Sir Rogelio, for joining us and sharing those thoughts. Interesting. Blue economy, the exploitation of our seabed, etc. Sige, mukhang kailangan ng another setup on that one. And I see Ms. Louie Parungaw, the head of the ESI of Miriam here. Maybe we could have a joint session to tackle that more in depth. It's 11:14 already. I'll just run through some questions and then up to you, Amiel and Paula, if you want to answer them. And then siguro we could close from there, no? So let me just read some. Jed mentioned kanina has been asking about which country can be the model for the Philippines with respect to best practices on climate change adaptation or mitigation. And presently, what does the Philippines lack? Technology, lack of structural coordination between national and local governments or scientific experts. Lady Lynn Mangada mentioned something about big infrastructure for adaptation or mitigation are decided by the national governments such as TPWH, but Paulo mentioned also earlier about local adaptations, right? We've answered the question about 1.5 decrease in CO2 concentration, and then also there's a question, comment and question about every time we encounter major typhoons, do we see improvements in the way we deal with them operationally, like early warning system, disaster response, and also in terms of urban planning? Somewhat mentioned or napasadaan kanina ni Mr. Rogelio. Last one, 1.5 decrease around or more than 500 ppm equivalent. Some claim we would have passed beyond the tipping point. Right. Anything you want to touch on from those comments and questions, Amiel and Paulo, before we close?
Well, for me personally, one of the things that we can do is because I'm a lawyer by profession, so maybe I'll comment something about improving yung current legal system that we have that are related to addressing climate change. Yes, we have the Climate Change Act, we have the Disaster Law Act, but as we discussed earlier, climate change is a cross-cutting issue. So when we talk about, for example, land and land rights of people, we have to. It's inevitable for us to look at the current land law that we have in the Philippines. And sadly speaking, we're still following the Land Law Act that was enacted during the time of the Americans, I think. And as far as I know, the Philippine Development Plan, the one that was crafted by the former president, that included a proposal for a National Land Use Act, which in a way addressed na rin yung issue ng like relocation, resettlement. Kasi nangyayari before in the past, pag may bagyo, we move some people. For example, again, using Yolanda as a case, we move them somewhere in the upland. Pero ang problema, yung services in those areas. That's why people have problem. Like walang eskwelahan, for example, walang kuryente, walang livelihood for people who are used to fishing. So these are things that we should consider in an amended land law in that instance. No, yung sa blue economy and related issues, I believe, yeah, dyan tayo pwedeng mag-bank on. Since we don't have enough financial resources, we can do, marami na yung mga discussions about, for example, nature-based solutions. Basically, you're tapping up nature to cope up with the impacts of climate change. When it comes to dun sa comment kanina ni Sir Rogelio, no, about financing by the national government and local government, as far as I know, meron ng system in place na I think they call it climate tagging, something like that in finance system where so basically sa General Appropriations Act, sa budget natin, whether national or local, you government, you have to tag whatever climate activity that you have, and dun mo ililink mo siya doon sa budget na binigay sa inyo. So that's one way of looking at the transparency of how you're going to spend the money that are given to you in terms of climate change. Yeah. That's it from me, Mix.
Thank you, Amel. Paulo?
Right. So I'll try to link good na sinabi ni Amel yung mga different But when it comes to, I think let's start with a model. It's one of those usual questions. What is the best model that the Philippines could adapt? Ironically, it's the Philippines is a model for other countries already, and we have to think about that. What we are doing is actually leading edge for developing countries. So they are the ones actually copying us. Yeah. What we lack, though, ironically, and I think I've been saying this, is a systematic way of thinking of risk and how do we actually do these climate change impacts. Climate change doesn't care about your borders or your political lines. It's a whole system problem. It doesn't care whether it's land or water. So it doesn't care kung merong boundary ba to ng Marikina tsaka Quezon City. It doesn't care about that. It's a whole system in itself. So we have to deal with it as a system. So yeah, I think the Blue Carbon Initiative, and I think I'm also talk about it. One of the biggest things, in areas that you have good natural environment, to protect it. In areas like built up cities, then figure out how are you going to complement physical infrastructure and nature-based solutions. Because it's better to be redundant in our defenses rather than to just solely prepare on one. This is how we look at it in a very systematic, holistic way. Because at the end of the day, we could do, each of us have our part to do. We, the lawyers or the politicians, we can't have to do all of these things, but we also need people to implement those things. And we also need to have I think the sciences and the social sciences to band together. If you tend to look at just the science, then where is justice and ethics? If you just look at the social science, then we might not be taking into account uncertainty or what we have not. It's a holistic way of approach to dealing with climate change. And I think that is what's lacking. And that's what actually where, let's say, look at Singapore or Japan, they actually have their own perspective of what a systems approach is. And then finally, I think just to end it on a lighter note, I guess, one of the biggest things with the IPCC is that it recommends for countries to look at their adaptation pathway based on their risk context. And you need to develop it based on what you have, what are the risks around your area, rather than looking at models elsewhere. Otherwise, what happens is that you might be copying something that doesn't apply to your local situation. So ayun lang, it's a systematic, holistic thinking and for the betterment of the future. And that's how sustainability works.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paolo and Miel. Was gonna ask you some closing statements, pero parang yun na yun, no? I was given permission to extend until 11:30. So if you don't mind, I'll run you my word association, if that's okay. Yeah.
Very close to. I'm just gonna mention possibly around, let's see, how many do I have on this one? I have 10, but then maybe we could do five words though.
So I'll mention the word and then just say something about it. Okay? Quick ones, all right? Ready? All right. First one. Let's go easy. Water.
Life.
Yeah.
Livelihood.
All right. COVID-19.
The plague.
Transboundary health issue.
All right. Transboundary. Climate fund.
Sorry.
Climate fund.
Pera. And we need more of that. We need more support. Yeah.
Ako nasa risk transfer yung perspective ko. Yeah.
Transfer. All right. USA.
We don't want them in negotiations. But they're nakakapikon sila sa negotiations.
I wanted to say inequity then something to that effect. Usually they're vocal, but remember during the time of President Trump, they left. So how could they be when historically they were the ones who contributed a lot, diba, to the emissions? Yeah.
China.
Oh, same.
Same. All right. Urbanism and
Urbanism.
population.
More than half of the world's population is urban right now. 64% of Asia's population will be urban by 2050, and 17 out of 22 megacities in the world are in the Asia Pacific region. Yun yung intro ng aking thesis. So,
Okay. Travel.
What's that one?
Travel.
Travel. Carbon footprint. That's one thing that we always tend to forget. We just love flying out in and out of Philippines, but we don't realize we're actually contributing more carbon when we do that.
Okay. Paolo?
consciensa ko yun kapag lumilipad to attend like conferences. Like, to share my work. I'm like,
Yung COP, ilang jet na pumunta sa Egypt?
yun yun. But yeah.
Right. Pagsamahin ko itong 8 and 9, La Nina and El Nino.
Extremes. So in the climate future, there will be extremes, more heat during the El Nino seasons, and more water during the La Nina seasons. But if people forget, the transition period between one system to another is also quite problematic.
Yeah. For me, I think more of the La Nina because we were talking about typhoons earlier. So the first thing that came to my mind was, again, coastal adaptation.
Right. Last one, global affairs.
We live in exciting times.
Yeah. Well, again, that's related to diplomacy and negotiation that we sort of discussed extensively earlier. No, you can never separate these terms from one another.
All right. Sige. And on that note, may pahabol kang assignment, Paolo, coming from our chair. So, kailangan natin tanungin. Maybe just also give your closing statements related to this one. And again, we thank you for joining us this morning, no? An hour and a half. So we'll start with Paolo. Anything closing related to geopolitics, climate change? And then siguro for you, Amiel, the same na rin. As a closing.
Right. I think in geopolitics of climate change, it's I think good way to end this is that we tend to look at our development plans based on certain, like, let's say, land use plans or policies, etc. But the environment is constantly changing. And if we do not take into account or we do not cope with the ever-changing environment that we have, there will be like quite a huge problem when it comes to addressing. For example, the areas sa Bulacan, yung lumulubog, yung pangalan ng lugar na to, basta yung lumulubog, yung kung nasaan dapat ilalagay airport. In paper, land yun. In reality, tubig na. Pero anong ginawa? Dahil nasa land siya, binili siya as land. Pero in reality, tubig siya. These are things that, our policies need to adapt. I was asked by someone to to do some incorporation of the new science. I could not do because ang ina-accept na science ng Pilipinas ay dapat nakalagay sa policy. But science is also ever evolving. So you have these things, and as I said, like problems of like climate change don't really care about borders, like imagined borders that we created. It has something to care about, like the environmental borders, fine, but the political borders doesn't really care about that. So it's, I think, to end that statement, we tend to look at water as something that is a border that divides nations. Ironically, water is something that made us connected with other nations. And so when we tackle climate change, you should not be an island, but rather use this water to traverse and connect with nations in order to address a global goal. So I guess yun. Ang hirap maging closing
Ang
statement.
ganda, ang ganda ng closing statement ni Paula. Water divides us but also connects us. Amiel,
Yeah, for me, well, first of all, banking on what Paulo said, well, we only have one atmosphere. Many people are saying that. That's why whatever is happening sa US, sa Europe, definitely will affect us. And that's why we can say na, okay, hindi naman kami concerned, for example, sa heat waves na nangyayari every summer in Europe or sa wildfires na nangyayari sa California during summer. May effect yon one way or another sa atin sa Pilipinas. No, but for me now, I think I'll just take this opportunity to talk directly to our audience, who I believe are students and also practitioners. For students, gusto kong balikan yung binanggit ni Paolo earlier about research. We need to produce credible research. It's hard to proceed to another step of addressing climate change, like having a good policy, having a good law. If we don't do enough research first, we have to have a grounding of data that are necessary to have good law and policy. And importante yon kasi both of you said in a way earlier now, ngayon that hindi pa ganun ka in place, and that's something that is actually lacking if you compare Philippines to a place like Singapore. And Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries are already doing that. No, they are investing a lot on research because they know the value of that. For practitioners, especially for example, our urban planners, I'll go with again what Paulo said earlier about having a systematic approach. You have to collaborate with other local government units in that sense, because you cannot do it alone on your own. Yeah.
all right. Thank you so much, Amiel. One atmosphere, we breathe the same air now, so we have to all act as one. And with that, maraming salamat, Amiel and Paolo, for joining us this morning. Very fruitful discussion. Sana nag-enjoy kayo as much as I enjoyed it. And let's continue our conversations about climate change and all. And just to close this one, again, this is the 8th episode of the Diplomatic Hour, or Miriam College Diplomatic Hour, a live stream, free-flowing conversation on political, economic, and humanitarian issues brought to you by the Institute of Global Affairs and Diplomacy. And just to plug that we are currently offering the 4-year Bachelor of Arts in Global Affairs and Diplomacy. You can see some more details on this in your chat box, the links that are posted in your chat box. Yan, magandang umaga, good morning to all, good afternoon, and good evening to those who are joining us from the other parts of the globe. Ako po si Dr. Mix Doroban, and one of the program consultants of PhD. And magandang umaga po ulit sa lahat. Thank you.